Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Karen Freeman Wilson, and I'm honored to be the president of the National League of Cities. I'm also honored to stand with my colleagues and welcome you to this important press conference. I want to thank our host, Mayor Muriel Bowser, for being here with us today as well. We are more than 2,000 leaders from America's cities, towns, villages, and other municipalities who are here to talk about one of the issues that is most important to everyone from Maine to California, and that is infrastructure. Having safe and reliable infrastructure is a priority of every single leader because all of our communities will benefit from reliable water infrastructure, great streets and highways, a trained workforce, and broadband infrastructure no matter where you live. Investing in our infrastructure and investing in the people who can build our infrastructure should be one of the single most priorities of government at every level. And so as local leaders, we are here this week calling on our federal government to rebuild with us. We understand that no branch of government, no level of government can do it alone. And so in Gary, a historic manufacturing town, one that has played a clear role because of our steel manufacturing in helping to build infrastructure throughout this world, we now are poised to invest in our own infrastructure, but none of this can happen without the partnership of the federal government. Those opportunities are shared by big cities like Los Angeles, where our council member and first vice president is from, Joe Buscaino, but also smaller cities like Lexington, South Carolina, where our second vice president, Kathy Maness, hails from, a council member from Lexington. And it's also shared by cities like Washington, D.C., our very own host city. We know that Mayor Bowser, who has been kind enough to chair our housing task force, is also an infrastructure champion. And we have seen the results of her hard work and leadership firsthand as we have traveled throughout Washington, D.C. At this time, I am honored to welcome Mayor Bowser to the podium. I want to also add my thanks to her for her leadership, not just in D.C., but her work with the National League of Cities. Please welcome to the podium my colleague, Mayor Muriel Bowser.
Well, good morning, and thank you, Madam President. I am honored to be here with 2,000 elected officials and delegates from across the United States of America, and very honored that the National League of Cities hails from Washington, D.C., and is hosting this conference here today. To my colleagues, fellow mayors, members of council, and appointed officials in our jurisdictions, thank you for your leadership on the big issues issues that face our nation. Washington, D.C. is indeed a growing city. We're 700,000 people strong with a strong local economy. In fact, one of the strongest in the region. And with our growth and prosperity, we have developed other problems. The problems of growth and prosperity, where we have an expanding income gap, opportunity gap, and in some cases, achievement gap for our young people. So in this year's conference, cities, jurisdictions of all sizes, people from both sides of the ideological spectrum are here today and during this conference to focus on the big issues that affect us. Mayors will frequently say there's no Democrat or Republican way to pick up the trash. And mayors and officials will also say that they meet their constituents in grocery stores. They meet them at PTA meetings. They meet them in church basements. And they have to have an answer for them. This is not a problem that sometimes the members of Congress face. And so we are here to remind them that they have to do their jobs with infrastructure. Our demands are for the White House, the Congress, and all officials to focus on infrastructure. Infrastructure will put Americans back to work. Infrastructure offers good paying jobs. And infrastructure will allow us to compete region to region, nation to nation across the globe. So this is the focus that we have had in the National League of Cities Housing Task Force as well. President Freeman Wilson asked me to think about the national housing crisis. And when you think about it, our jurisdictions have different issues, but we still have housing pressures. And the 22 of us from cities big and small, Democrats and Republicans, have come together to identify solutions that will inform the work of the National League of Cities in talking to the Congress and in talking to the administration. We know that the demands on housing, like in our city where there are housing shortages, have to be met. We also know in cities that are facing vacant property, how those properties can be repurposed for the benefit of the greater city is important. And we also know that cities that seemingly have nothing in common sadly have a homeless problem in common. And so all of the ideas from around the nation that can be put together will be delivered to the Housing Task Force. And we will work with our great staff here at the National League of Cities to make sure the nation knows how to help American cities. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Mayor Bowser, for your leadership and commitment to your city and to our organization, to also our leader, Mayor Karen Freeman Wilson. Thank you, Karen, for your friendship as well and your guidance of this organization. And my colleague officer, Kathy Manis, as well, our second vice president. You know what the beauty is today and throughout this week is we have over 2,000 municipal leaders here in Washington, D.C. And what we don't do, we don't walk around Washington, D.C. as we storm Capitol Hill with a D or an R on our forehead. What we do here as elected leaders is we are demanding that Congress listens to us, meets our infrastructure needs, and put all partisan politics aside for the betterment of our country and the cities who we represent. I can tell you firsthand, I'm here with my colleague, Curran Price, who represents South Los Angeles. In Los Angeles, we've expanded our rail lines. In fact, we have the largest infrastructure project ×2 this country has ever seen. My colleague in Long Beach, Roberto Uranga, he and I represent combined number 8 in the world largest seaport. And we, too, are working on infrastructure needs for our greatest port of entries in Los Angeles, and we're doing this with limited resources, such as fixing pavement for bicycle traffic and getting the city's roads and transit systems ready for the 2028 Olympics. In 2016, we couldn't wait for the federal government to act. So we took it upon ourselves in 2016 when voters passed Measure M, which added a half-a-cent sales tax to help raise dollars for infrastructure improvements. But there are limits to what Los Angeles or any other city can do without proactive federal engagement and funding. Overall in California, 5.5% of our bridges are rated structurally deficient. Our state's drinking water system requires a $45.5 billion investment, while our wastewater infrastructure needs $26.2 billion, and that's a lot of money. So we know that when we get together, federal and local governments can make a real difference to improve a city's infrastructure. Tiger grants helped us to improve access to Metro Rail, and similar partnership efforts have not only improved the city's infrastructure, they've overall created jobs, which ultimately has improved our quality of life for our residents. So now is the time for Congress to continue supporting local governments by making these infrastructure investments. America's cities and local leaders stand ready to work together and rebuild our nation, the bright future our citizens rightly deserve. So now I'd like to welcome Kathy Manis, our second Vice President of the National League of Cities and Council Member of Lexington, South Carolina. Kathy.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Well, good morning. I'm Kathy Manis, and I'm a councilwoman from the town of Lexington, South Carolina. Very small compared to my friend in Los Angeles. But you know what? We have our own problems, too. So whether you're in a large city or in a small town, when I started running for town council 14 years ago, we had about 5,000 people in our town. Now we have 20,000. We are one of the fastest growing municipalities in the state of South Carolina, but we have our problems. We have traffic problems all over. I go out to eat, I go shopping. When y'all gonna do something about that traffic? Well, we're trying. Our council has passed an hospitality tax. It took courage for our council to pass that tax. But we knew that we could not depend on our federal government. We could not depend on our state government. So we had to do what was best for the citizens in the town of Lexington. And we did that. And we're doing that. We're working on our traffic issue, which is the #1 issue in our town. But you know what? Traffic, potholes, fixing bridges, that's not a Republican or a Democrat problem. It is everyone's problem. And Congress must come together. Put aside their differences. They need to rebuild with us. We need to have infrastructure in our cities and towns. So it is an honor for me today to introduce our Executive Director, Clarence Anthony.
Thank you very much. And thank you all so much for being here. And we have an amazing leadership team representing American cities, towns, and villages. And we also are honored to have our host mayor here, who I'm going to give a shameless plug because this is the first time that Congress has actually passed a statehood resolution to support statehood for Washington, D.C. And now, when you're in those meetings with the senators, just encourage them to do the right thing as well. But we also need to encourage them to do the right thing about rebuild with us here in America to get an infrastructure bill. This is the time that is right. This is the time that we can get it done. And this is the time for city leaders to send a message to our congressional members. We're driving the infrastructure message. We're asking you to use the hashtag #PoundRebuildWithUs and tell your infrastructure story like Kathy just did, because it will make a difference. So now we'd like to provide the press an opportunity to ask any questions associated with our platform related to infrastructure or any other topics that you may have an interest in. If you could state your name and where your press you represent, we will respond to those questions. Any questions? I love this. Oh, yeah, good. Come on up.
For Mayor Bowser, Mark Seagraves, local NBC4 here. Mayor Bowser, what's your message to Congress today with you and all these leaders from across the country as far as what you want the federal government and Congress and the White House to do as far as infrastructure and affordable housing? You mentioned the homeless problem that everybody up there seems to have in common.
Well, I think that you've heard from all the leaders here that we want them to be serious about investing in American infrastructure. That's bridges, that's highways, that's transit. For us, Mark, the focus would be on transit and what the federal government is going to do to pay its fair share of our metro cost. Now, I always include our housing stock in an infrastructure discussion as well. And the federal government, part of our task force work is what more can the federal government do to stabilize housing. And that may be the role it plays in public housing, that may be in rental assistance across the board, that may be in emergency funding, but the federal government has a role to play in shoring up the nation's housing stock. What we know is when people have unstable housing or are burdened by housing costs, they can't take care of every other issue in their life, be it their health, their children's education, getting a better job. So we have to put housing at the top of the list.
As it relates to infrastructure, we want to have very concrete conversations with Congress about the methods of funding, the importance of bipartisanship, the importance of workforce development in this conversation, and the importance of resilience. You know, so often when we talk about the roads and the transit and broadband and water, those are all really important. But unless you have a trained workforce to actually get that done, to construct the infrastructure, then all of the discussion is in vain. And then we want them to remember, because sometimes it's easy to be removed, as Mayor Bowser has said, this is about people. This is about creating opportunity, upward mobility, and mobility for the citizens that have entrusted us with serving them.
And lastly, if I may, you know, local leaders here before you, it's our duty and our obligation to balance budgets in the cities that we represent. We don't have the luxury of printing money. And this is why we're demanding Congress to pass a long-term infrastructure bill. We need stability in this these funding sources so that we can move on these critical infrastructure projects.
The bottom line is we got a D+ in America on infrastructure. We need an infrastructure bill. Yes, sir.
James Wright, Washington Informer newspaper. Mayor Bowser, as the chair of this task force, are you going to encourage your colleagues to do what we do here in Washington? We have a housing production trust fund. Are you going to encourage your colleagues to take a look at that possibly in their municipalities?
Well, we certainly expect, James, to have an analysis of what's working around the nation and a bucket of best practices to share among each other. So the Housing Production Trust Fund has worked for us. We're very much interested in our neighbors in Maryland and Virginia duplicating our Housing Production Trust Fund because what we have learned is the housing issue doesn't stay neatly within one jurisdiction, but it impacts the entire region.
And the task force will come up with a number of solutions throughout America that we will share with other leaders. Yes. Yes. Oh. This is going to be a great question here. What's your name, Emma?
And I'm from the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Youth Council in Charlotte, North Carolina. And so as one of the 200 or so youth delegates here, we are young people who are already working on these issues alongside you in our communities and who will continue to be building on them as we progress. And so if any of you, I know we have a vast amount of experience here, and we're honored to be a part of that today. What would be your cautions, what would be your advice as we continue to build off of the work that you're doing now moving forward on issues like infrastructure and other issues in our cities?
The first thing I want to do is thank you all for your leadership and for your presence. You know, one of the best parts of the conference for me is the time that I get to spend listening to your ideas, learning from you, and hearing your energy, not just about your future leadership, but about your current leadership. So I wanted to tell you to keep doing what you're doing because you're on your way.
Yes.
The second thing is that I think it's important to share with your colleagues who may not be at this conference or meetings like this that infrastructure matters to them. And sometimes it's important for us to break that down to our colleagues and our citizens. You know, infrastructure sounds like this big word that's so unachievable or unattainable. But really what we're talking about are roads, rail, broadband, water infrastructure, or water pipes, sewers, and people understand that. We're talking about how people get to school or get to work or get to play. We're talking about how people enjoy the water in their community and how they don't have to worry about whether it is clean or safe to swim in. And once you break it down that way and help us to communicate it in all of the methods that you use that we may not be as adept in, then it amplifies the message not just to young people around the world, but to people around the world. And they, in turn, can help us get the message to the Congress, also to our governors and state legislatures, so that we are working on this issue together. So thank you for being a leadership of the present, and we look forward to working with you in the future to build our communities.
If I can, Madam President, thank you. You know, when we talk about transportation and infrastructure in our cities, and we look at the future in our youth, continue to elevate your voices. And part of our transportation and infrastructure initiative is to focus on broadband. I mean, you are well connected. Our young people are well connected using the internet and the fingers of our cell phones. But it's important to have a connectivity among neighborhoods, communities, and cities because you are our future. And when we talk about transportation, I'm a son. I have a 16-year-old son and a 12-year-old daughter, and we're talking about dockless mobility, dockless bikes, dockless scooters. If we talk about dockless scooters today, it could be hoverboards tomorrow. Who knows what's to come? So you need to be a part of that voice and a part of leading that effort. So we thank you for being here.
With that, let me thank all of you. First of all, everybody, thank you all for being here this press conference. This is the kickoff of our Congressional Cities Conference. What we are expecting is that we're going to learn, we're going to network, and we're going to charge the Hill on Wednesday to send the message to rebuild with us. Our infrastructure in America needs leadership, and here's what leadership looks like. Thank you all very much, and have a great conference.